Hey gang, what's going on out there? What's a crack-a-lackin'? We are looking today at America and the Great War, as they called it back in 1914. You know it today as World War I, so let's get going. Now, whenever you study World War I, we always hear about the isms that animate. And whenever we talk about World War I, we always start by talking about the isms that drive all these nations to war, things like nationalism, imperialism, militarism. So let's start with the first one. We know this as imperialism. What's going on in Europe, and to some extent, in fact, to a large extent in the United States, is a policy in which strong nations seek to dominate other countries politically, socially, or economically. In the United States, we saw how the U.S. was extending its influence over the Pacific in places like the Philippines, in Cuba, in Guam, Puerto Rico, and Wake Island, and of course more. And while we were using these overseas territories for markets and for resources, we justified that through the policy of benevolent assimilation, essentially saying that the United States is teaching these nations to be ready for self-rule, that we have something to offer that they could not offer themselves. It's of course loaded with the language of social Darwinism, that we're better than them, but then an imperialist has to justify his actions in some way. Now, England, as you can see by the political cartoon, was the master of imperialism on the eve of World War I. It was said that the English had so much territory from Cairo to Cape Town that the sun never set on the English Empire. So imperialism is one of these guiding forces behind the First World War. If we're going to have a giant war, then the winner of that war is going to have territory. The loser is going to have to give it up. Now, the second ism, it doesn't end in ism, but so well, is called the alliance system. This is a formal agreement between two or more nations or powers to cooperate with one another and come to one another's defense should something happen. So you can see, we're going to look at this in much more detail, but you can see in the political cartoon, little tiny Serbia is being attacked by Austria, and then Serbia's ally Russia is coming to the aid of Serbia, and then Germany is attacking Russia, and then you see France coming after Germany, and so on. So it's like a domino effect. A system of alliances in which you attack one and you set off a series of events that eventually draws everybody into war. So here's how the alliance system is going to work on the eve of World War I. You've got these two alliances, two great powers that are multi-nation. First, you have the Triple Entente, and they're also known as the Allies, and that's England, France, and Russia. They had coalesced into a military alliance before 1914 with the agreement that if one is attacked, then the rest are going to come to that nation's aid. Now, the second group are called the Central Powers, also called the Triple Alliance, and that will be Germany, the Empire of Austria-Hungary, which is no longer around today, and at the beginning here, Italy. Now you can see Italy's colored green here. That's because they eventually do switch over to the Allies side, but in 1914, Italy is going to be on the side of the Central Powers. Now, the other ism that we are considering is called militarism, and just to dramatize that, let's talk about how much military spending some of our chief nations here, Great Britain, France, Germany, and Russia, are doing in 1918 versus what they're spending on the military in 1914. Great Britain is spending $287 million in 1908. Now, by 1914, they're up to $347 million. France, 216 million in '08, and by 1914, when World War I breaks out, they're spending 363 million. Germany, 286 million, and then, wow, look at Germany, 463 million. You know, I gotta point something out. A lot of historians are going to take the position that World War I was really nobody's fault. World War I was just a bunch of countries that share equal responsibility in bringing about a worldwide catastrophe, and this could have been avoided if they had all agreed to work together. I tend to disagree. It's not a real popular thing to say, but I blame Germany, okay? I think Germany was the chief aggressor. Yes, everybody shares some of the blame, but this is one of the things I look to. Germany was far outspending everybody else in 1914. Russia, we keep going. Russia was spending 291 million, and Russia not too far behind Germany, 434 million. So we're going to keep going, and you know, if you don't believe me, if you don't understand, or if you don't agree with me that Germany was primarily, not solely, but primarily at fault for World War I, that is okay. I'm not going to get too upset with you, because I have gotten in arguments with my professors in college and in graduate school over this very thing, and we're just going to have to agree that you're wrong. Another thing that characterizes militarism is that this war has some major upgrades in hardware. We are seeing some things appear in large scale that we have never seen before, such as the machine gun, poison gas, also tanks introduced by the British, airplanes. Now, airplanes were, of course, invented before World War I, as were most of these things, but this is the first time that they're going to be used in combat. Now, not to the extent that they're going to be used in World War II. In fact, airplanes don't really have any kind of major strategic impact on the outcome of World War I, but they are going to be present nonetheless. Also, this one, definitely highlight this one, put a star by that one and circle it, and then draw a little smiley face by it just so that you can come back to it. The German Unterseeboot. Are you impressed with my German? Das Unterseeboot. Or der, I don't know. The submarine is a upgrade that Germany invents, and is going to be one of the leading reasons. The use of it is going to be one of the reasons why the United States eventually agrees to get into this war. Because of these things, the machine guns and submarines and tanks and poison gas, warfare becomes much, much deadlier than it had been before. Warfare was it was safer before World War I. You'd go into war and you might get injured, but what would kill you would be disease or infection. But now you don't stand a chance when you're getting mowed down by a machine gun. So warfare and the casualties in war are going to skyrocket in World War I in ways that the European and the American populations have never seen before. And a culture of death is going to prevail after the war that's going to make people want to really avoid getting into this stuff again. Of course, Hitler's going to change everybody's minds, but lest I get into that, let's keep moving. So here we are, June of 1914. The Archduke, that is the heir to the Austrian throne, Francis Ferdinand, is assassinated by a Bosnian nationalist while he's traveling in Serbia. Now take a minute to digest that. The heir to the Austrian throne. Austria-Hungary is a very large empire, and they're a multi-ethnic empire. They have a lot of different voices of a lot of different cultures and a lot of different people with a lot of different agendas, and they are all grouped together loosely within this political entity called Austria-Hungary. Now, Francis Ferdinand, who's the heir apparent to the Austrian throne, is traveling in one of these far-flung Austrian holdings when he is assassinated. He's traveling in Serbia, when he is assassinated. And the guy that he's assassinated by isn't even Serbian, he is Bosnian. But the Bosnians claim a ethnic solidarity with the Serbians. So what this boils down to is we don't like you traveling among our people. We don't like you acting as an imperialist among our people. So that's why he got shot. And what the Austro-Hungarian Empire does, what the government does, is they become absolutely furious with Serbia. And they demand that Serbia make amends for the assassination of their Archduke. Now, the assassin was not even Serbian. He didn't even represent a country, per se. He represents an ideology. You may compare him in a loose way to something like Al-Qaeda, where they don't actually represent a nation state. They represent a radical ideology. And this is what the Black Hand, the group that this Bosnian nationalist represented, this was what he is most closely aligned with, an ideological movement that wants to free all of these nation states or all these ethnic groups from the clutches of Austria. Well, Serbia, because they didn't do this, they don't have anything to do with this assassination, they say no. We're not going to make amends, and we're not going to do what Austria-Hungary demands. They had demanded that they turn their country inside out, that they, essentially start censoring the universities and the newspapers of all subversive materials. And Serbia just says, no, we're not going to answer your demands. And so what Austria-Hungary begins to do is they begin to call up their troops and they begin to mobilize against Serbia to make Serbia obey. Now, Germany. Now this is me thinking, okay? This is me paying attention to this and me having studied European history for a lot longer than anybody thinks is normal. Germany offers Austria a blank check. And what we mean by that is the German government says, look, if you're going to go to war here, we've got you covered. And what this is doing is this is, in a sense, encouraging Austria to pursue an aggressive policy toward their neighbor Serbia. And this means that Germany, who is allied with Austria, is going to now have license to get into a larger war. The Germans had been speaking of the day, and they called it the day, der Tag, the day in German, when they would engage in a major European war. And it seems like they've got an opportunity now in their midst. And so what began to blaze right after this, one historian, Barbara Tuchman, has called the Guns of August. Austria and Germany mobilize against recalcitrant Serbia, who will not live up to the Austrian ultimatum. In response to this, Russia, who is an ally with Serbia, begins to mobilize against Germany and Austria. And the reason why Russia is interested in doing this is because she has declared that she has an ethnic solidarity with the Serbians. They are our little Slavic brothers, she says. And because France has a military alliance with Russia, then France begins to mobilize against Germany, and Italy cautiously, and we said Italy's going to switch teams in a little bit, 1915, but Italy then cautiously sides with Germany and Italy. Italy's sensing that the political winds are shifting, and she senses, wrongly it turns out, that Germany and Austria are going to win, and so Italy sides with Germany and Germany and Italy. Now England, you say, what is England doing? England is watching. England has a alliance with Belgium, and a tentative alliance with France and Russia, but England's primary alliance is with Belgium. If Belgium's neutrality is compromised by anybody, then England is obligated to jump into this war. So right now, England is surveying the situation, so to speak. Well, since 1905, and yes, keep in mind this date, 1905, the Germans have been planning for Der Tag, the day. And one of their leading generals, Alfred von Schlieffen, has put into place what's called the Schlieffen Plan. He has planned this out. And notice that this is 1914, and Germany has had a plan to go to war since 1905. Okay, yeah, I know. All nations have plans to go to war. All nations have defensive strategies in mind. Our country has military outcomes planned out right now. But Germany's plan is not defensive, it is offensive. This is her plan to win a two-front war and win it quickly. The Schlieffen Plan is in several stages. Stage 1 is quick. Launch a massive assault on France using newly constructed railroad lines. What we will do is we will conquer Paris before the French have had a chance to mobilize. We will capture the flag. We will raise the German flag over the Eiffel Tower, and then we will quickly double back and speed over to Russia, and we will destroy the Tsar before he knew what hit him. So the Schlieffen Plan is based, it hinges on speed, it hinges on technology, and it also hinges on that green country right there. Do you see them right between France and Germany? That's Belgium. Now, Belgium has long declared her neutrality in this conflict. She says, I'm not taking sides, I'm not getting involved, but she does have a military alliance with England. So, once this is done, then Germany says, we will negotiate peace terms from a position of strength, and we will have our place in the sun, as one German leader once put it. So, the Schlieffen Plan, ladies and gentlemen, will it work? Well, as we said, the problem is Belgium is neutral, and the Schlieffen Plan, it depends on speed through Belgium. Now, England has a treaty with Belgium. Says if Belgium's neutrality is violated, then England is brought into the war. Germany doesn't want this to happen. Germany does not want to fight England as well as France and Russia. Germany would rather keep the war contained if at all possible. Well, Germany attempts to negotiate safe passage through Belgium without the Belgians putting up much of a fight. But Belgium says, no, you're not using us as a speed bump. We are going to put up a fight. And so Germany decides to rip through Belgium anyway. And this is the source of major international outcry. How dare you violate a independent and neutral country's neutrality for the sake of your own war aims? And so all across Europe and the United States are these reports of German massacres. The German rape of Belgium is what it's called. Now, of course, a lot of these reports are very much exaggerated. Yes, it was war. Yes, Germany did awful things. People do awful things in war, but they were nowhere near as barbarous and as mean and as barbaric and as cruel as the propaganda in London and in Washington and in France made them out to be. But nevertheless, this so-called rape of Belgium is going to make for awfully saucy reading, and a lot of people are going to be very upset about it. Well, the plan was to get through Belgium very quickly. The Germans gave themselves about a week. They said, we're going to get through in about a week, and the Schlieffen Plan will be saved. So the Belgians have to flee, but they do put up quite a hell of a fight for 6 weeks. And what this does is it ruins the Schlieffen Plan. It delays the German advance, and then guess what? It's over now. Now Germany is forced to fight a two-front war. And this rape of Belgium becomes the great propaganda piece in England and the United States. And one of the reasons why so many people are so mad at Germany for so long is because of what they supposedly did to Belgium. So here you have a lot of this, this is from the New York Tribune, a lot of this propaganda about how Belgium was just violated and ransacked. And yeah, it was an invasion, it was brutal, it was bad, but nowhere near as bad as the English and the American press made it out to be. Look at that one, that one's from England. Miss Edith Cavell murdered, there she is, a German soldier just shooting her dead in the street. Well, with the Schlieffen Plan now ruined, what's going to happen is the Allies and the Central Powers are going to come to a stalemate along the Western Front. In other words, in their advance toward France, the Germans are stopped by the French, who now have time to mobilize, and they pull everybody together. Taxi cabs rushing soldiers to the front. It was a great heroic effort. They shall not pass is the cry. And they stop them midway. And as you can see in the map there, what they have to do is they have to dig into the ground. And they end up fighting these series of long, drawn-out, bloody battles of attrition that are ultimately inconsequential. And what is known as trench warfare, where they have to stare and stare off in the grounds for a really, really long time. And none of these battles really come to much. Well, at the same time, one of the things that England decides to do is to utilize her massive navy and blockade the ports of Germany, which at this time are largely landlocked. And what this is going to do is it's going to keep food from being imported into Germany. Food, supplies, medicines, a lot of the things that they're going to need. And so Germany's going to be unable to trade with anybody else or even feed herself if this English blockade, this naval blockade, is not broken. What is America doing? What's the American response? Well, Woodrow Wilson, back in the United States, issues a statement at the outbreak of war in 1914. He says, "Every man who really loves America will act and speak in the true spirit of neutrality." Neutrality, which is the spirit of impartiality and fairness and friendliness to all concerned. The United States must be neutral in fact, as well as in name. During these days, there are to try men's souls. There he's quoting directly from Thomas Paine in Common Sense, which, oddly enough, ironically, was a call to war, not to neutrality. I like that. We must be impartial in thought as well as action, put a curb upon our sentiments as well as upon every transaction that might be construed as a preference of one party to the struggle before another. In other words, we're staying out of it, Europe. You guys can go stew in your own blood. We're neutral. And here's Woodrow Wilson appearing on a political cartoon, steering clear of the rocks. On the one side is war, on the other side is intervention. We're not going for either one of those. We're steering for justice down the center. And in 1916, as he gears up for the next presidential campaign, his slogan is, "He kept us out of war." This, of course, begs the question, just how neutral is the United States? Do we have any kind of inclination toward the Allies or toward the Central Powers? Well, one way to view this is by looking at this chart of U.S. exports to belligerents, 1914 with the outbreak of the war till 1916, which is the year before the United States ends it. So a belligerent is a country that's doing the fighting, so that would be Britain, France, Germany, Italy. And if you look at the number of exports to, say, Great Britain, you'll see that the number drastically increases until in 1916, you're looking at a percentage of the 1914 figure that is 257%. The same can be said of France, which continues to increase. And then look, with Italy, the same thing happens as well. Note, Italy joins the Allies in 1915 and increases her exports through that as well. Now, if you look at Germany, what begins to happen is exactly the opposite. We were very happy to export to Germany in 1914 and even in 1915, and then those numbers drop to almost nothing. Of course, there we are, just to look at the British numbers once again. You can see how much we are exporting. These are U.S. companies, U.S. corporations, how much they are exporting to Great Britain. Of course, we can't trade with Germany. The British blockade is forbidding that from happening. And a lot of American manufacturers will wonder why. American manufacturers and American commerce has always thought that this is our right to be able to do these things. You guys are fighting a war. We're not. It should be our right to trade with whoever we want. This has sort of been like a freedom of the seas thing that Americans have always trumpeted. Still, Wilson's foreign policy is decidedly pro-British. The propaganda coming from the White House, the language coming from the White House, and the general mood of the country is pro-British. Just to make this a little clearer, take a look at U.S. corporate profits. These are the companies that are churning out war material. They are churning out all sorts of manufactured goods that they will be using in order to fight the war in Europe. So from the beginning of the war, 1914, the assassination of the Archduke Francis Ferdinand, till the end of the war in the end of 1918, beginning in 1919, you see corporate profits in the United States are reaching a fever pitch. There are a lot of people making a lot of money off of this war in the United States. Prompts the cynical statement that war is the health of the state. Well, it's certainly good for the economy in this case. And this isn't loved by everybody. This pro-British, anti-German sentiment that we have is noticed by the Fatherland, which is a German-American newspaper. They write, "We Americans prattle on about humanity while we manufacture poison shrapnel and picric acid for profit. 10,000 German widows, 10,000 orphans, 10,000 graves bear the legend, made in America." Well, German civilians are truly starving. And in order to break the British blockade, in February of 1915, Berlin, the government of Germany, announced a submarine war area around the British Isles, essentially saying that if you're traveling in or around the British Isles, you are liable to be sunk by our Unterseeboots, our submarines. In February and March 1915, the U.S. continues to trade with Great Britain and the Allies, and the Americans continue to sail on British ships, very much considering this to be our right, our prerogative. We're not belligerents. Don't target us. In April 1915, knowing that this is the case, the German government publishes a major warning in major American newspapers. And this warning is telling Americans not to sail on ships flying the British flag. And this is to American citizens as well as American manufacturers and shippers. They're saying, look, we're at war with Great Britain, and if you sail with a vessel flying the flag of Great Britain or any of our allies, you're liable to destruction because we're at war with them and we're going to shoot their vessels down. So please do not sail with the British. And I see this as an attempt to keep America out of the war, to keep America pacified, because Germany has no interest in seeing another ally of the Allies, another ally of Great Britain. And so to publish these things is a way of telling Americans, please, this isn't your fight. Please don't sail with the British. We don't want to have to hurt you. Well, in May of 1915, a British passenger ship called the Lusitania set sail with British and American passengers, and I think you know what happens after that. This is obviously not a good idea to sail on a British passenger ship. The Germans claim that it's carrying munitions. Later, this is found to be absolutely true. But this is the fate of the Lusitania. A German U-boat targets her and shoots her. 2 torpedoes sink it, and what do you see? Over 1,000 passengers die, including 128 American citizens, and this causes outrage in the United States. The Germans, of course, claimed that the ship was carrying munitions, and it was carrying munitions. It was a belligerent ship. It was not simply carrying passengers. And American public opinion turns decidedly against Germany for this supposed act of cowardice, this act of barbarism. How dare Germany sink a passenger ship when there's so many other legitimate targets out there? Well, the Germans apologize for the Lusitania. They actually say, we're so sorry, we had no intention of killing 128 Americans. At this point, there is no proof that was carrying munitions. That will happen much later after the war is over and the Lusitania is excavated down in the water, and we'll learn this later, but right now there's no public knowledge of this. And the Germans say, we're so sorry, we'll never do this again. Well, we're far from finished from seeing the end of Germany's submarine warfare. It's one of the great advantages they have in the war that they've developed these machines and they want to use them. So in March of 1916, a French passenger ship called the Sussex is torpedoed by a German U-boat. And of course, the Germans feel completely justified in targeting a French ship because they are officially at war with France. Well, American sentiment turns even more toward hating Germany. President Wilson then threatens to cut diplomatic relations with Germany. And you can see this cartoon here. Uncle Sam sitting and he's thinking and he's pondering. And the book, if you look at the book at his feet, it says 1777. That is, of course, the year before we signed a formal alliance with France during the Revolutionary War after the Battle of Saratoga in 1778. And you can see the shadowy figure standing before him. Of course, that is the Marquis de Lafayette, the French general who greatly aided the American cause in the the American Revolution. So what you're seeing here is American sentiment turning pro-French as well as pro-English. In April of 1916, Germany again throws her hands up and says, we're sorry. We don't mean to target civilians. And they issue what's called the Sussex Pledge. And this is, again, a olive branch to the United States saying, we do not have any intent of harming civilians unless we absolutely have to. The Sussex Pledge reads, in accordance with the general principles of visit and search and the destruction of merchant vessels recognized by international law, such vessels, both within and without the area declared a naval war zone, shall not be sunk without warning, and without saving human lives, unless the ship attempts to escape or offer resistance. So the Sussex Pledge is not a pledge not to sink any more ships, but of course they say, we're going to give you warning, and we're going to allow all the women and children to get off, and if it proves that you're simply a merchant vessel and you have absolutely no interest in the war effort, then sure, we'll let you go. So that Sussex Pledge is given to the United States by Germany in 1916. And then in March of 1917, the British feel that, well, perhaps the United States is becoming too comfortable with their position with Germany. Germany is clearly trying to keep the United States out of the war, and at this point, British intelligence go to the United States and they hand over an intercepted telegram, which they have decoded and translated. And this is a telegram from the German Foreign Secretary, Arthur Zimmermann, to Mexico. And what it turns out to be, it's an alliance proposal. It's an alliance proposal from Germany to Mexico. And in short, it says that if Mexico will agree to enter the war on the side of the Central Powers, on the side of Germany and Austria-Hungary, Then in return, Germany will help Mexico regain the Mexican cession of 1848, and that would of course be large chunks of the American Southwest, New Mexico, California, Arizona, perhaps even pieces of Texas would be threatened depending on how you interpret the Mexican cession. And if you recall, Mexico is not a disinterested party. It was Woodrow Wilson, after all, who had overthrown Mexico's government and established who he wanted in the presidency of Mexico. And so a lot of Mexicans, you remember certainly Pancho Villa, had a lot of bitter feelings toward the United States. See them as a meddler in their affairs. Not only did you steal our land in 1846, 1848, but you've been meddling in our affairs ever since. And Wilson decides that the best idea here, in order to fan the flames of resentment against Germany, is to release the Zimmerman telegram to the American press. And we can take a closer look at the Zimmerman telegram right now. It reads, "We intend to begin on the 1st of February unrestricted submarine warfare. This means we're going to attack whoever we please. We shall endeavor, in spite of this, to keep the United States of America neutral," and they had been. "In the event of this not succeeding, we make Mexico a proposal of alliance on the following basis. We make war together, make peace together, generous financial support, and an understanding on our part that Mexico is to reconquer the lost territory in Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. The settlement in detail is left to you. You will inform the President of the above most secretly as soon as the outbreak of war with the United States of America is certain, and add the suggestion that he should, on his own initiative, invite Japan to immediate adherence, and at the same time mediate between Japan and ourselves. Please call the President's attention to the fact that the ruthless employment of our submarines now offers the prospect of compelling England in a few months to make peace." This from Arthur Zimmerman. And of course, what is the consequences of the Zimmerman telegram? Americans are absolutely outraged that Mexico has been approached by Germany and that Germany is planning to seize territory in the United States on behalf of Mexico. This is outrageous to a lot of people. Well, once the Zimmerman telegram goes public and Germany's plans are known to everybody, Germany realizes that she can no longer hide anything and she no longer has any credibility with the United States, so she issues a statement of unrestricted submarine warfare. In other words, we don't care who we shoot, we don't care who's on these ships. If you're sailing out there, you're a fair target for us. The declaration from the German government reads, "The destructive designs of our opponents cannot be expressed more strongly. We have been challenged to fight to the end. We accept this challenge. We stake everything and we shall be victorious." So in other words, this is do or die for Germany. We're going to break this British blockade. We're going to end this war, or we are going to die trying. Well, President Wilson calls an emergency session of Congress together after Germany has announced its policy of unrestricted submarine warfare. And Wilson's message is essentially, let's go to war. He says, the world must be made safe for democracy. Its peace must be planted upon the tested foundations of political liberty. We have no selfish ends to serve. We desire no conquest, no dominion. We seek no indemnities for ourselves, no material compensation for the sacrifices we shall freely make. We are but one of the champions of the rights of mankind. We shall be satisfied when those rights have been made as secure as the faith and the freedom of nations can make them. And of course, Congress agrees to authorize war against Germany and against the Central Powers, and the United States enters into this conflict. You will recall that the United States cannot simply swing into action and go to war against Germany and Austria-Hungary simply because it wants to. You recall that it has always been our tradition not to have a large standing army. We have traditionally considered large standing armies and navies to be threats to liberty, and so we've always kept them rather small. Well, in 1917, Congress is empowered to carry out the Selective Service Act of 1917, which is a draft. It's passed, like we said, in 1917, requires every man between 18 and 30, which is later elevated to 45, to register for the draft. That is, appear before a draft board, give them your name, go through a physical, and make yourself available should the Army need you. In all, 24 million white Americans and 2 million black Americans are drafted into the Army by the war's end. And when you compare that to the less than 200,000 soldiers that the American military had before the war, you can see that the Selective Service Act of 1917 was very effective. Unlike the Civil War, where a lot of people did a lot of draft dodging, a lot of people tried to sell their service, buy their way out of service. Conscription went very smoothly. Just 350,000 guys dodged the draft, and most people went willingly. There was a wave of patriotism sweeping the country, and a lot of people, most of the men who served, simply believed it was their patriotic duty to do so. One interesting case that we're going to bring up of a guy who didn't want to serve but ended up doing so is a man named Alvin York. Alvin York is from New York, and Alvin York is a Bible-believing Christian. And as a Bible-believing Christian, a Protestant Christian, he has his doubts about whether or not enlisting is compatible with his Christian beliefs. And so he asks the United States Selective Service Act, the Selective Service Board, for an exemption as a conscientious objector. He says, and he writes, these are his own words, he says, I'm a member of a well-organized religious sect whose then existing creed or principles forbids its members to participate in the war. So in other words, I'm a Christian, and I don't think that fighting a war is in keeping with Christ's teaching, and I'm not going to do so. In his autobiography, written years after the war, Alvin York says, I wanted to follow both, that is the Bible and the United States Army, but I couldn't. I wanted to do what was right. If I went away to war and fought and killed, according to the reading of my Bible, I weren't a good Christian. Well, his request is actually denied. He's told, yeah, sure, Alvin, you might be a Bible-believing Christian, but there's lots of Bible-believing Christians in the Army, and tell you what, suit up because you're going to war. So Alvin York ends up serving. He does such an exemplary job in the military that he becomes Sergeant York and ends up one of the most decorated soldiers in the entire war. He's not just a guy who serves and does well. He proves to be an exemplary killing machine. He's credited with the destruction of over 20 German soldiers single-handedly. He stayed on the front lines until after the armistice was signed in 1919, despite the fact that he had already been honorably discharged from service. He's lauded by the New York Times as the war's biggest hero. And General John J. Pershing, who is the commander of the American Expeditionary Force, we'll hear more about him in a minute, called him the greatest civilian soldier. He's very much in keeping with that tradition of the civilian soldier. He's not a professional soldier. He's a civilian soldier. And he is awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor, a very high distinction for a soldier to have. Upon his death in 1964, President Lyndon Johnson calls him a symbol of American courage and sacrifice, who epitomized the gallantry of American fighting men and their sacrifices on behalf of freedom. And it keeps going. In 1941, Alvin York gets his own movie. He doesn't star in it, but Gary Cooper plays Alvin York in Hollywood's own Sergeant York. Well, one of the effects of World War I on the American economy and on American government is that they both get really big. Hello again, big government. This tends to happen in times of war because we need to mobilize the resources of the country on behalf of the war effort, and this requires federal organization. So the government establishes the War Industries Board. Now, The agency is established in 1917 to increase efficiency and discourage waste in war-related industries. Now, check out this part in red. The government agency oversaw the production of all American factories. It, that is, this arm of the federal government, determined priorities, allocated raw materials, and fixed prices. And it, that is, this branch of the federal government, told manufacturers what they could and could not produce. Now I'm hearing you laissez-faire advocates out there starting to groan. I'm hearing you free market fundamentalists starting to say, what is this? Is this the government that we are fighting for? Well, like it or not, this was the role of the government in 1917. Is it a command economy? I would say yes. Yes, it is. When government is controlling the outflow of resources, and when government is fixing prices, and when government is telling manufacturers how much and what to produce, this is a command economy. A second arm of government that grows is the Food Administration of 1917. The Lever Food and Fuel Control Act of 1917. Now, I just want you to know the Food Administration created what's called the Food Administration, headed by the future Republican President Herbert Hoover during World War I. The administration sought to raise agricultural production while reducing civilian use of foodstuffs in order to conduct the war efficiently, as exemplified by the slogan, "Food will win the war." So this is a rationing board. And Herbert Hoover, later to be the president that has the misfortune of being in office as the Great Depression hits in 1929, Hoover is going to be in charge of it. So you tend to think of Hoover as this like laissez-faire guy. He doesn't like big government, and that is absolutely true. And one of the places that he learns to hate big government is in World War I, when he sees how big and how powerful government became in order to win the war. And we keep going. We're not done growing government. So there's also the Railroad Administration. Now I want you to go back. Think about when we looked at those documents in class, where we saw the foundation, where the Transcontinental Railroad was first chartered by the U.S. government. In other words, that partnership between private industry and the U.S. government, part of the contract read that the government can take over the railroads whenever it needs them in service of prosecuting a war. And that happens. In 1917, the Railroad Administration is formed by the federal government. And again, it's a federal agency which took all the railroads from private hands. Read that again. Took all the railroads from private hands. That's right. It nationalized the railroads. You can say socialized if you want to. That's fine. It's seen as a temporary measure. But this is government taking control of the railroads, and it's going to use them for the transportation of men and war material. So the railroads are not going to be operated by private concern anymore. They're operated by the government. Another thing that the government establishes is the Committee on Public Education. Now, this is a propaganda committee. This is a committee headed by a guy named George Creel. And what they are to do is they're going to build support for the war effort in Europe among Americans. All sorts of propaganda, posters and newsreels, and something called the Four Minutemen are going to come out, and they are going to do their best to depict Germans and other enemies on really bad terms, and they're going to serve a role in censoring the press. And the guy who you want to associate that with is So Creel's campaign, like we said, was to employ these 4 Minutemen. Now, these are guys who are deputized by the government who get on trains and they go from town to town and they give these patriotic pep talks. Usually longer than 4 minutes, yeah. But they're called 4 Minutemen. In fact, some of these guys can go on for up to 20, 30 minutes. But nevertheless, these are 4 Minutemen who are supposed to increase public support for the war. They give these speeches wherever they will be given an audience. Okay, movie theaters, churches, synagogues, labor unions, lodge and grange halls. Creel claimed that his 75,000 orators, that's an army in and of itself, had delivered 7.5 million speeches to more than 314 million people. His advice to his 4-minute-men, George Creel, is there was never a speech. There never was a speech yet that couldn't be. Let me start that again. There never was a speech yet that couldn't be improved. Never be satisfied with success. Aim to be more successful and still more successful. So keep your eyes open. Read all the papers every day to find a new slogan or a new phraseology or a new idea to replace something you have in your speech. Conceive of your speech as a mosaic made up of 500 or 600 words, each one of which has its function. Very good advice for those of you thinking of a career in rhetoric or on how you can craft your speech to an audience and sort of caress the ears of your hearer and get what you want out of them. He was a master of propaganda. And here they are. Here are some 4-minute men delivering an address in New York City. And another way in which the Committee on Public Information could drum up support, quite literally drum it up, is by writing music and putting it out to the mass public so that people could walk around humming and singing the propaganda of the day. One of the most famous ones, probably the most famous song written in support of a war effort, is by George M. Cohen, and it's called Over There. And if you just look at the lyrics with me, it goes, Johnny, get your gun, get your gun, get your gun. Take it on the run, on the run, on the run. Hear them calling you and me, every son of liberty. Hurry right away, no delay, go today. Make your daddy glad to have had such a lad. Tell your sweetheart not to pine, to be proud her boys in line. Over there, over there. Send the word over there. That the Yanks are coming, the Yanks are coming, the drum-tum-tummings everywhere. So prepare, say a prayer, send the word to beware. We'll be over, we're coming over, and we won't come back till it's over there. Yeah, I only meant to do 2 or 3 lines, but I just get carried away. I would appreciate that if you don't rebroadcast that anywhere. It could mean my job. Well, you're looking at Herbert Hoover and the oversight of the Food Administration. You saw that government grew another head and decided to take part in rationing food. So under Herbert Hoover, the U.S. Food Administration undertook a massive advertising campaign to encourage Americans to conserve some of the resources that they have so that more can be sent overseas. Of course, we're talking sugarcane and syrup in this poster. The other one is talking about a school garden. Children were encouraged to start gardens so that they could feed themselves rather than depending on commercial agriculture, because we need this stuff for the war effort. Americans were encouraged to go wheatless on certain days and meatless on certain days. You would have, for example, wheatless Wednesday and meatless Monday. Easy to remember. And the meat that you would supposedly eat would go to the support the war effort. That one's one of my favorite ones. Be patriotic, sign your country's pledge to save the food. Now, I should point out that this was not law. There is no legislation passed saying what you can or cannot eat. This was simply Congress asking Americans to be patriotic in support of the war effort and to volunteer to do these things. And nothing symbolized the volunteer effort more than a victory garden. Here you can see it. Americans were expected, now it wasn't a law, no one's going to come make you do it, but nevertheless Americans were expected to grow these victory gardens in their lawns, in their yards, preferably in your front yard, so that you could display your patriotic duty to the rest of your neighbors. The more food that is grown, the more the government can use to supply the Allies in Europe. So by growing these victory gardens, you're not only conserving food so that it can be sent overseas, but you're also displaying your loyalty. And the government is not going to be able to raise all of its money through volunteerism alone. So of course there is the War Revenues Act of 1917. This is where the federal government raised the lowest tax rate from 1% to 2%, and those with incomes above 1.5 million were to be taxed at 15%. You recall that when we had the 16th Amendment, which instituted the income tax for the first time under Woodrow Wilson, then most Americans were exempt, and only 4% of Americans would pay an income tax. Well, that extends quite a bit into about 6-7% of Americans by World War I. And the act also imposed new taxes on estates and excess business profiles. Then there's the Victory Loan Campaign of 1919. Now, 1919 is the date on which a lot of these loans were to be made good on, collected, but the Victory Loan Campaign begins as early as 1917. The Treasury Department promoted the sale of Liberty loans through public drives. These totals amounted to $21 billion by 1918. So you can see the date is a little misleading, the Victory Loan Campaign of 1919. And what you're supposed to do is you are supposed to loan the government some money from your own pocket. And this will help to finance the war effort. And then when times are good, when the government is no longer needing as much cash immediately, then the government will pay you back over time with interest. So it's supposed to be not just a patriotic thing to do, but also a good investment. And Americans do buy victory loan campaigns at, like we said, the tune of $21 billion. And here's some of the propaganda posters that are going to go along with it. Over the top for you, buy U.S. government bonds. I like the second one from the left. Our daddy is fighting at the front for you, underline you. Back him up, buy a United States government bond. Then there's the Statue of Liberty. You buy a Liberty bond, lest I perish. Oh, you better put your money where your mouth is, or else Lady Liberty could be no more. And there's Woodrow Wilson on one. Back him up with your Liberty bonds. And it says at the bottom, I hope you can read it, the safest investment in the world. So your third Liberty loan, your second Liberty loan, all of these Liberty loan agencies are designed to raise money for the U.S. government, but it's also supposed to be an investment. This one is my all-time favorite, though. It just tugs on the heartstrings. My daddy, says this little girl with the bow in her hair, my daddy bought me a government bond of the third Liberty loans. Did yours? And of course, if your dad didn't, well, what's his problem? Well, one of the interesting ironies about the United States fighting for democracy overseas is that a lot of our civil liberties at home became challenged to an extent. The word that floats around that a lot of people wanted to make mandatory was this concept of 100% American. You couldn't have any other loyalties anywhere else. You had to be, whatever this is, 100% American. And the CPI promoted long-established ethnic groups and encouraged them to be 100% American. And of course, German Americans bore the brunt of this campaign. They would encourage them to stop using the German language and stop eating traditional German foods or otherwise observing some kind of traditional German festival and become what they called 100% American. So this is not a hamburger. Okay, 100% Americans are not going to eat hamburgers. They are going to eat Liberty sandwiches. Okay, you see the difference, right? Because one is called a Liberty sandwich and the other's not. So, big difference. Now, this is not a Frankfurter. You understand? This is not a Frankfurter. This is a hot dog. This one sticks. This one is one that we still use today, but people used to call them Frankfurters. This one's one of my favorites. This is not sauerkraut. Okay, everybody paying attention? It's not sauerkraut. This is Liberty cabbage. So you can still have the food. You just have to call it something else. Well, if you thought that renaming the Frankfurter and the sauerkraut was a little strange, it gets even stranger. This is an article that appeared in the New York Times on a bill that was introduced into Congress in June of 1918. Let's take a closer look. It reads, in the opinion of Representative J.M.C. Smith of Michigan, this guy has introduced into the House of Representatives a bill to change the names of municipalities that are cities, counties, townships, and streets and highways from Berlin or Germany to Liberty, Victory, or some other patriotic designation. Now, the bill to change the names of, say, Germantown, Pennsylvania, or something like that, failed Congress. Congress did not agree to this entirely, but again, in the spirit of volunteerism, Germantown, Nebraska became Garland, Nebraska, USA. Berlin, Iowa became Lincoln, Iowa, USA. You also have East Germantown, Indiana became Pershing, USA. That's, of course, after John J. Pershing, head of the American Expeditionary Force. And Berlin, Michigan became Marne, Michigan, USA, after the first Battle of the Marne in World War I. That's right, people. True Americanism. Well, another movement that got going during war is an older movement called Prohibition. The temperance movement, the movement to ban alcohol, this has been around for at least since the 1830s during the period of antebellum reform. But now that we're fighting the Germans, alcohol really does get a bad name. So, like we said, the temperance, the anti-alcohol people had been working to ban the booze since the mid-19th century, and World War I simply gave them a moral edge. After all, we can point out, beer is a German drink, and no one wants to be caught supporting any kind of German drink, or perhaps even giving money to a German industry. You know where that's going to go. And so prohibitionists will argue further that the grains needed to distill alcohol, that is what you need, the raw materials needed to make these drinks, were needed as food and were in short supply because of the needs of the war. And so this will effectively shut down the country's breweries and distilleries, at least temporarily. And a permanent ban on the sale, transportation, importing, and exporting of alcoholic beverages was enacted by the passage of the 18th Amendment to the U.S. And a lot of people think of this as a progressive move or something that happens in the 20s, forgetting, or perhaps never knowing, that the move to ban alcohol really got underway and was passed by Congress during World War I, at the beginning of World War I, December of 1917, and it takes until after the war for all of the states to fall in line and ratify the 18th Amendment, or the states required to ratify the 18th Amendment. But this is a wartime move more than it is a progressive move. You can call it a progressive move. It's not wrong to associate progressivism with prohibition, but I think that the war gave this move the impetus that it needed. So you can see from this propaganda poster here, you've got an American soldier. He's raising his bayonet. He's pointing right at you like Uncle Sam would, and he says, "Will you back me or back the booze?" In other words, you cannot do both. You can't both have a Budweiser or a Schlitz beer or one of those, and also be for the war effort. So there's a moral and patriotic imperative to ban the booze. Vote yes for prohibition. Congress also enacts two key pieces of legislation in 1917 and 1918 that are designed to stifle dissent and encourage support for the war. The first one is called the Espionage Act, passed by Congress in 1917. And this empowers Congress to impose sentences, jail sentences, of up to 25 years if you're found guilty of aiding the enemy, obstructing the recruitment of soldiers, or in any way discouraging or encouraging disloyalty. And the Postmaster General is authorized to remove from the mail any materials that incite treason or insurrection. So it's a little bit of a question, raises questions about our First Amendment rights during the war. The next one is called the Sedition Act of 1918, and it's an addendum to the Espionage Act. It meant to cover the printing, writing, uttering of disloyal, profane, scurrilous, and abusive language about the American form of government, the Constitution, the flag, or the armed forces. So it harkens back to the Alien and Sedition Act of 1798, suggesting that it's illegal to even say anything about your country that would be construed as disloyal or profane, and yes, they can put you in jail if you do so. Now, there are a few cases of the execution of these two acts that may seem to us rather stupid, rather silly, but they are true. One involves a Quaker teacher who was jailed in New York for refusing to teach the pro-war curriculum. You'll recall that Quakers are generally pacifists. They don't approve of war or joining armies or mobilization, and so she wouldn't teach that you had the pro-war curriculum that she'd been charged with teaching, so they threw her in jail. Another case has to do with a Lutheran pastor, and he is jailed because he gave a funeral sermon in German. Somebody had died, and all of it was a young man who had died, and the young man's grandparents were German immigrants and could only speak German. And the Lutheran pastor decided that in order for them to fully participate, he would translate his sermon from English into German. And of course, he got arrested and sent to jail, or rather sentenced to jail for something like 20 months. I'm not sure if he served the whole thing, but for 20 months was the original sentence. And here's the ironic part. Who was the boy in the casket? The boy in the casket was an American soldier who had been brought home after dying on the front, serving his country against Germany. Very ironic. The last case that I want to point out is where a filmmaker is jailed for making a Revolutionary War film in which the British turn out to be the bad guys. You see, wait a minute, weren't the British the bad guys during the Revolutionary War? Well, yes, it was, but let's not take any liberties here with history. We all know that the British fight for liberty just like we do, and so this filmmaker has to go to jail because the British turn out to be the bad guys in the Revolutionary War. One of the most famous cases prosecuted under the Espionage Act was that of Eugene V. Debs. You recall Eugene V. Debs was a socialist, and he believed that the Great War was being fought for capitalist ends and had nothing to do with freedom or the working man, and so he spoke out against the draft. And under the Espionage Act, he was jailed for up to 20 years, and it was Warren G. Harding who actually pardoned him a while later, but poor Eugene V. Debs went to jail for a time. Now, here's a court case dealing with the situations that we've been talking about. This man is Charles Schneck, and he is, like Eugene V. Debs, a member of the Socialist Party in America. Now, Schneck believes the war is wrong. He thinks it's a war waged by capitalists for capitalists, and he doesn't think that the U.S. should be participating in the war effort. And so he goes and he circulates a pamphlet, and it's got a title that may seem ironic to you, but he certainly believes it's true. It's called Long Live the Constitution of the United States, in which Schneck points out a certain part of the Constitution. And this is a PDF, a photocopy of that very pamphlet here. I think this is kind of neat. He reads, "The 13th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States," quoted above, embodies this sacred idea. The Socialist Party says that this idea is violated by the Conscription Act. Now, recall, what's the 13th Amendment do? It abolishes slavery and says that nobody can be turned into a slave and do something for them unless they're duly paid, unless it's voluntary. And he says, when you conscript a man and compel him to go abroad to fight against his will, you violate the most sacred right of personal liberty and substitute for it what Daniel Webster called despotism in its worst form. A conscript is a little better than a convict. He is deprived of his liberty and of his right to think and act as a free man. A conscripted citizen is forced to surrender his right as a citizen and become a subject. He's forced into involuntary servitude. He is deprived of the protection given him by the Constitution of the United States. So Charles Schneck believes that the Conscription Act, the Selective Service Act of 1917, violates the 13th Amendment because it drags men off to serve in the Army against their will. Well, the Supreme Court is going to hear Schneck's case. So in the Schneck v. United States 1919, the court rules the most stringent protection of free speech would not protect a man in falsely shouting fire in a theater and causing a panic. The question in every case is whether the words used are used in such circumstances and are of such a nature as to create a clear and present danger that they will bring about the substantive evils that Congress has a right to prevent. So if you haven't caught on, the Supreme Court rules against Schneck, and he says, look, by distributing this propaganda of yours, by distributing your pamphlet in which you're saying that people cannot be conscripted into the army under the 13th Amendment, you are causing a panic, and the consequences of your action will bring about a greater evil than whatever evil you are trying to prevent. So that's from the Chief Justice, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes. He rules against Schneck in 1919. These acts, the Espionage and the Sedition Act, you might think they've gone away, but they're actually still active pieces of legislation. Who was the last president to seek prosecution of a citizen under the Espionage Act? Do you suppose it was Woodrow Wilson? Was he the last one? They were approved under him. Was it FDR during World War II or the New Deal? Was it George W. Bush, perhaps under the global war on terror? Or was it President Barack Obama? I will give you just a minute to go and run and ask your parents and find out which is true. Believe it or not, President Barack Obama was the last president to seek a conviction under the Espionage Act. And of course, I don't need to go into a lot of details because everybody knows the name Edward Snowden by now. So President Obama was the last president and our current president to use to seek a conviction under the Espionage Act. Well, to get ready to go to war is a major undertaking of the United States government. The U.S. fighting force is going to increase from just 200,000 at the beginning of 1917 to 4 million men by the war's end. Now, you'll recall that 24 million ended up registering for the draft, but of those that registered, 4 million are going to serve. So they're all civilians. We don't have a huge standing army. Americans do not like huge standing armies, at least at this time. They consider huge standing armies to be threats to liberty. So they're all civilians, and they have to be trained, they have to be equipped, they have to be moved and sent overseas. The man who's in charge of this job is General John J. Pershing. He's the commander of the American Expeditionary Force. And he gets to take these 4 million American boys and turn them into an elite fighting force ready to take on the Germans and the Austrians and so on. They are known as Pershing's doughboys. Why are they called doughboys? Do we know why they're called doughboys? Nobody really knows why they're called doughboys. Some people suggest that when they arrive in France, that because the French have been fighting so long and been hardened by war and somewhat calloused by war, that the fresh-faced American troops appeared to them to be doughy, that is, soft. And another suggestion is that they ate donuts, and I don't know which one is at all more credible, but for better or for worse, Pershing's soldiers in France were called Pershing's doughboys. Now, they were not a homogeneous, they weren't all the same. You, in fact, had 1/5 of the fighting force foreign-born. That's right, 1/5 of the American fighting force fighting in France is foreign-born. They spoke 49 different languages and had to be organized into units based on language so that they could understand their commanders. Black men also participated as part of Pershing's doughboys. More than 400,000 black men enlisted, and that is 13% of the total armed forces. And black men did not see combat as often as white men. This is due to prejudice held by a lot of people at the time that black men just could not make good soldiers. And of course, we know that your ability to fight is of course not dependent at all on your skin color. But at the time, this was part of the popular belief. And so Pershing insisted that the troops be segregated. Now, one of the reasons why Pershing insisted on this was not due to his own racism, but rather because he didn't want to see the men fighting with one another. It happens. You take guys from the north, guys from the south, they don't often get along. You take black men, you take white men, you take men of Hispanic origin, and unfortunately, this is a different time and place, they do not often get along. Pershing says, I don't have time for this, you all are segregated. Now, the Germans made a big deal out of this. The Germans made all sorts of noise about the fact that the Americans claimed to be fighting for democracy, and yet at the same time they are segregating their own armed forces. This is a German propaganda leaflet that would be dropped over the trenches where black soldiers were known to have been fighting when they did fight, or they would be dropped over a group of black soldiers in order to entice them to leave the war effort. It says, "Hello, boys. What are you doing over here? Fighting the Germans? Why? Have they ever done you any harm?" Of course, some white folks and the lying English-American papers told you that the Germans ought to be wiped out for the sake of humanity and democracy. What is democracy? Personal freedom? All citizens enjoying the same rights and socially before the law? Do you enjoy the same rights as the white people do in America, the land of freedom and democracy? Or are you not rather treated over there as second-class citizens? Can you get into a restaurant where white people dine? Can you get a seat in a railroad car or even ride in the South in the same streetcar with white people? And how about the law? Is lynching and the most horrible crimes connected therewith a law proceeding in a democratic country? Now, all this is entirely different in Germany, where they do like colored people, where they treat them as gentlemen and as white men, and quite a number of colored people have mighty fine positions in business in Berlin and other big German cities. Why then fight the Germans only for the benefit of the Wall Street robbers and to protect the millions that they have loaned to the English, French, and Italians? Well, in time, the American soldiers do see a lot of action, and it is just in time. When the American boots hit the ground, I don't think that another week could have been wasted getting there. Because in 1917, just as the Americans enter, Russia experienced an internal revolution and gave up the fight against Germany. And so what this does is, because Russia gives up and has their communist revolution, which we'll talk about in the 20s, this allows Germany to launch a major offensive on France, and they come within 50 miles of Paris by May. Pershing shows up like I said, just in time, sent in 60,000 doughboys to aid the French at the Battle of Chateau Thierry, and the mere sight of the doughboys led the Germans to despair, because they had been there for 3 years. They'd been in the mud fighting in the trenches for 3 years and hadn't really gotten anywhere. And all of a sudden, here come these 60,000 fresh-faced American kids singing over there, and let's just give up, okay? So the Allies then, with great and significant support from the Americans, halted the German advance and sent them into retreat for the first time. So the Americans broke the stalemate on the Western Front before the Germans did. So the Americans' primary contribution to the Allied war effort in the First World War is they showed up at just the right time and broke the stalemate on the Western Front, fighting the Germans off at Belleau Wood and forcing them into a battle called the Argonne Forest. And there the Germans, demoralized and sick from the flu — there was actually a worldwide flu epidemic going on right now — surrendered to the Allies. And so Germany surrendered officially on November 8th, 1918. Wilson taking a lot of the credit for this, and rightfully so. The Americans did provide the much-needed manpower to break the stalemate on the Western Front and force the surrender at Argonne Forest, but Wilson headed off to France like an absolute conquering hero. Believing that he had such political capital, he made a major mistake back home, and that is, he didn't ask any Republicans to accompany him on the peace delegation, taking only his fellow Democrats. And then, to make things even worse, he goes on record as saying that the Republicans must take their medicine. Well, at Versailles, Wilson assumed that he would be the recognized leader of the conference. And indeed, he did have a lot of political capital in Paris when he shows up. He was recognized as a major world leader, as an emerging world power, the United States was, and he did have a lot of people that looked to him for leadership. There he is. Now, his idea was that we should settle for a peace without victory, and also a peace among equals. This is Wilson's vision. Remember, Wilson is very much an idealist. You recall his moral diplomacy, where he believed that political goals could be achieved not through a show of force and not through coercion, but by moral example. He introduces to the peace negotiation what is known as his 14 points. That is 14 big ideas, goals that he would like to see the Versailles Conference pursue. Now, 14, one delegate remarked. He said, "God Almighty gave us 10, and we broke them. Woodrow Wilson gives us 14. We shall see." Well, it was a very idealistic dream, these 14 points. We'll see what they... Well, the 14 points are Wilson's vision for the post-war world. They're the goals outlined by the president at Versailles in 1919, in which he believed, if followed, would promote lasting peace among all nations. The first thing he had asked for was self-determination, that is, for European nations. We're talking about these multi-ethnic empires such as the Austro-Hungarian Empire or even the German Empire, in which they control or impose sovereignty over smaller national groups. Take, for example, the Slavic people or the Magyar people in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He believes, as many people believe, that as an independent ethnic group, they should have their own nation with their own borders, their own elected governments and their own sovereignty, the right to decide their own fate. Of course, he means this for Europe. When African nations, they sort of pipe up and say, hey, how about us? Woodrow Wilson says, well, no, of course not. You're African. Woodrow Wilson, he's very much guided by racism. He was one of the more racist presidents. He did not believe that black people had the ability or the intelligence to govern themselves, and so he's going to be one of the leading voices against allowing African or Asian nations this concept of self-determination. Well, he does want freedom of the seas, and by that he means let's come to some international agreement to restrain those U-boats that have been harassing trade and making life really miserable for a lot of people, especially us, for a long time. He would also like to institute free trade, that is international capitalism, and he also would like to see European nations lower their tariffs against each other and against the United States, believing that free trade will be good for everybody. And of course, Woodrow Wilson is a Democrat, and Democrats have never liked that tariff. And so if he can get that lowered throughout Europe, if he could encourage European nations to lower their tariffs, that would be great for the South and for the West. Another thing that he wants is end secret agreements among nations. This means secret alliances. Let's not meet in dark, shadowy, smoky corners and have these secret alliances to back each other up. Let's show all of our cards, get it all out on the table. You'll know where I stand, I'll know where you stand, and that way we can hopefully negotiate rather than go to war. So, next thing he wants is a reduction of arms. Let's not build up these huge arsenals, especially given the mass scale of destruction that we're looking at in the wake of the First World War. Let's try to scale back the number of arms. Let's come to some kind of international agreement about what everybody is going to have and what everybody is going to build. And he's thinking this is going to make war a lot less likely. Of course, you're remembering militarism being one of the chief causes of World War I. We all want to try out our upgrades. And you're thinking, yeah, right, who's going to make this all work? Is everybody just going to agree to lower their tariffs? Is everybody just going to agree to make less machine guns? And of course, by themselves, no. Which is why Woodrow Wilson proposes the centerpiece of his 14 points, which is a League of Nations, an international group of nations that will meet as equals in order to arbitrate, work out their differences. If somebody's got a grievance against another one, rather than rushing to war, let's rush to negotiation. If somebody's got a problem, let's talk it out like civilized nations, rather than orchestrating these secret agreements and rushing into war and causing what we have just seen in the First World War. So this League of Nations is instrumental to making any of the other 14 points work. You've got to have some kind of enforcement mechanism, and you've got to have other nations volunteer to essentially give up a little bit of sovereignty in order to do this. I mean, it's like the social contract, right? You have to give up a little bit of your freedom in the name of security. Well, as idealistic as Woodrow Wilson is, the other winners at Versailles, namely France and England, have some other things to say. Their terms are quite a bit harsher. They're saying, how about this? We want Germany disarmed, and we want Germany to accept the war guilt. In other words, Germany's going to be the one who gives up all her weapons, and Germany's going to foot the bill for this whole thing. Germany's going to admit it's our fault, we did this, we'll pay for it. We also want the dissolution of Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire. These were the other two members of the Central Powers. We didn't talk a whole lot about the Ottomans, and if you'd like to hear more, of course, you will love to take European history with me and hear more about the Ottoman Empire. But two empires are going to be broken up and dissolved, and this is in the name of self-determination. We're going to have an independent Czechoslovakia come out of Austria-Hungary and an independent Turkey, just to name two. So we don't want empires. We want self-governing democracies or republics. Another thing that we're going to demand is an independent Poland. Poland, you're thinking, what does that mean? Poland hasn't actually been independent since 1795. They have been in part under the heel of Russia, and in part under the heel of Germany. And so what the victors at Versailles are saying is, we're going to have an independent Poland, and this is something that the Russians often appreciate because they would like to see a buffer zone between them and Germany so they don't get invaded again. Then they do agree to the League of Nations. The victors agree, yes, we're going to have some kind of enforcement mechanism. We're going to have some kind of international community that's going to regulate affairs between us so that we do not end up in this giant world war again. So just to demonstrate what happens to the map of Europe before World War I, or during the course of World War I, and after World War I. So in 1914, let's have a look. This is what the map looks like in 1914. Now, take a look what happens in 1918. It's quite a bit different, isn't it? For example, look what is gone. Gone is the German Empire. And what is going to replace it is something called the Weimar Republic. Now, that's Germany, but it's called the Weimar Republic. What had actually happened was the German High Command had advocated, had given up control, and handed over the reins of government to a Republican government, and then said, see ya, you guys sign the peace. And so the Weimar Republic has to take all the blame for World War I. Well, they hadn't actually been empowered during any of World War I. But the German Empire is gone, and the Weimar Republic, emphasize Republic, has been born. Also gone is the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Look at that big purple blob in the middle of Central Europe. That encompassed a lot of different ethnic groups. And what you get rising out of the Austro-Hungarian Empire are the eastern successor states. So have a look. You have states such as Austria, you have Hungary, you have Czechoslovakia, and then you've got the Balkans being reorganized into a group called Yugoslavia. That means all Slavs. And that's, well, not going to really satisfy a lot of the Slavs either. They want to see their own independent ethnic groups rise up. But it's an attempt. It's an effort to try to give some people self-determination. Also gone is the Ottoman Empire, and I know that's very difficult to see, but the Ottoman Empire is Turkey. So what's going to emerge from this is Turkey, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. Now, on the one hand, this is very idealistic of the Versailles Treaty to try to create modern nation states out of the Ottoman Empire, and on the other hand, it is incredibly nearsighted to try to do so, because they're going to draw political boundaries around peoples that historically have not had a lot to do with each other and sometimes don't like each other. Prime example, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon. These are nations that are going to be racked by civil war and are continuing to be racked by civil war. All you need to do is think about ISIS, right? Well, the Covenant of the League of Nations is a very ambitious proposal. They suggest in Article 10, just to highlight a few, the members undertake to preserve us against external aggression, the territorial integrity, and existing political independence of all members. So, if we have borders, those borders are going to be maintained by the League. Any war or threat of war is hereby declared a matter of concern to the whole League. And the League shall take any action that may be deemed wise and effectual to safeguard the peace of nations. Very important clause. We're not going to go to war. War is outlawed. Unless, of course, the League's going to go to war to stop war. I know, it's complicated, but the idea behind it is, let's talk before fight. Let's discuss, let's arbitrate, let's get a host of nations involved before we simply take out our sabers and start slashing each other to ribbons. Article 12 reads, if there should arise between any of them, that's the member nations, any dispute likely to lead to a rupture, a war, they will submit the matter either to the Council, And they agree in no case to resort to war until 3 months after the award by the council. So we can't just go to war because we've got a problem with somebody. I don't like your face. I think my neutrality or my rights have been violated. I think that something's wrong. We have to go to the council. And the council will arbitrate and try to work things out. And in any case, you don't do anything until you give the council 3 months to work it out. So you can see we're trying to avoid war. Well, it all sounds great, but will it work? One of the questions that the delegates have to consider and Woodrow Wilson has to consider is, will the U.S. Senate agree to the League of Nations? After all, any kind of foreign treaty has got to be approved by the Senate, and joining the League of Nations certainly does qualify as a foreign treaty. Well, in fact, this is where Woodrow Wilson's political mistakes back home, especially in dealing with the Republicans, are going to cost him in his idealistic dream for a post-war world. This is the Republican Majority Leader, Henry Cabot Lodge. You recall Henry Cabot Lodge from the days of imperialism when he was arguing forcefully for the annexation of the Philippines. Well, in this case, Henry Cabot Lodge has absolutely no love for the League of Nations. He writes, "When I think of the United States, first, in an arrangement like this, I am thinking of what is best for the world. For if the United States fails, the best hopes of mankind fail with it. I have never had but one allegiance. I cannot divide it now. I have loved but one flag, and I cannot share that devotion and give affection to the mongrel banner invented for a league. Internationalism, illustrated by the Bolshevik, that's the communist, and by the men to whom all countries are alike, provided they can make money out of them, is to me repulsive. I must remain, and in that way I, like all other Americans, can render the amplest service to the world. The United States is the world's best hope, but if you fetter her, that means if you put restraints on her, if you literally handcuff her, in the interest through quarrels of other nations, if you tangle her in the intrigues of Europe, you will destroy her powerful good and endanger her very existence." So that's a lot to say. One of the first points that he makes is that the United States is the best hope for the world. He does believe in benevolent assimilation. He does believe that the United States has a role, a moral role, and a moral example to hold up itself for the rest of the world. And in doing this, she cannot give up her sovereignty. She cannot give up her right to act unilaterally if she sees fit. And then he goes even further and kind of insults the League in saying that this is a mongrel banner. That's not a very nice word. Mongrel banner invented for a league. And then he says that this is something with which the Bolsheviks would approve. And if the communists approve of it, well, we can't like it at all. And he says the U.S. is the world's best hope. But if you fetter her, if you restrain her, if you tell the United States that she cannot act unilaterally when she believes it is necessary, then you're going to involve her in the old world blood feuds. He calls those the intrigues of Europe. And then what's the purpose of having a United States anymore? You endanger her very existence. So no, Henry Cabot Lodge, the Republican Majority Leader in the Senate, is not going to approve the League of Nations, and he is going to rally the Republicans against approving the League of Nations, and the United States does not join the League of Nations. And although the League will carry on for several more years without United States participation, the whole point was to get the major world powers, of which the United States is one, on board. And so without the United States joining the League of Nations, I'm afraid that this League of Good Intentions is doomed to pointlessness, and we will see its impotence, its inability to act when we see the rise of Hitler and Mussolini and Hirohito of Japan. So poor Woodrow Wilson waits for a decision on the League. The Senate votes, 39 are in favor, and 55 are opposed. The Republicans, by and large, oppose joining the League of Nations. One of the side stories, not insignificant at all, but one of the stories that takes place in conjunction to the Great War is that of women's suffrage. No, women did not begin asking for the vote in World War I. In fact, women like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton had been demanding the vote since as early as 1848. What begins to happen as a result of World War I is that the movement towards suffrage begins to accelerate. Part of this is because women were an instrumental part of the war effort. Women worked in factories. Women created munitions. Women took on jobs that they had not previously done. And this was done because the country needed them. Now, this is not going to happen to the scale on the scale that it will happen in World War II, whereas you're thinking of, say, Rosie the Riveter, the iconic woman who rolls up her sleeve and goes to work while the men are fighting the war. But it does happen. And the war provides women's suffragettes, that is, women who have been agitating for the vote, a platform, a moral platform from which to demand that the country pay more attention to them. Look at this sign that these suffragettes are placing in front of the White House. It reads, "President Wilson is deceiving the world when he appears as the prophet of democracy." Remember, Wilson had said that we are fighting to keep the world safe for democracy. They say, President Wilson has opposed those who demand democracy for this country. He's talking about women. He's talking about women who are denied suffrage. And they have a point. Women are going to pay taxes. Women are going to have decisions made on their behalf by a government. But, well, they do not have representation in that government. The sign reads, "He, that is Wilson, is responsible for the disenfranchisement of millions of Americans." We in America know this. The world will find him out. In other words, they're calling Wilson a hypocrite. He's a charlatan. He's selling us a bill of goods. He's talking about democracy across the planet when half of his own country is unrepresented in Congress. How is this fair, they say. Here's another one. I think this one is even more to the point. These women say, "We protest against the 34 willful senators," and we'll find out where these senators are, "who have delayed the political freedom of American women. They have obstructed the war program of the president. They have lined up the Senate with Prussia by their denial of self-government to the people." Prussia is, of course, the largest state in Germany. And I think it's interesting how they're calling Wilson out on denying self-government to the people. In other words, when Wilson is running around with his 14 points saying that people like the Czechs and the Slovaks and the Poles should have self-determination, at the same time he is publicly opposing women's suffrage back home. And so they're calling this a contradiction. We can't have this, Wilson. Another poster that is put up, I think this one is very interesting. It's calling out all of the ways in which women have served the war effort. Farmers, mechanics, nurses, doctors, munitions workers, mine workers, yeomen, keep going. You can see this list of what women are doing for the country is very long. The other side of it, what do they ask? Women are asking of their country. What are they? One thing they want, the vote. Are women getting it? No, they're not. Not immediately. Well, Carrie Chapman Catt, who was a leader of the National Women's Suffrage Organization, in fact, the president at one point, addressed Congress in 1917. You see, these women's suffrage amendments have been coming up from time to time. The first one came up in 1887 and was promptly voted down. Well, with the war, people are beginning to take seriously the rhetoric about giving women representation. So Carrie Chapman Catt addresses Congress, and she says, "How can our nation escape the logic it has never failed to follow when its last unenfranchised class," that's the people without the vote, "calls for the vote? Behold our Uncle Sam floating the banner in one hand, taxation without representation is tyranny, and with the other seizing billions of dollars in taxes paid by women, whom he refuses representation." In other words, women pay taxes. Women are members of this country, and they pay for the war effort just as anybody else. Why aren't they given representation? Catt goes on. "Is there a single man who can justify such inequity or treatment, such outrageous discrimination? Not one. But women do." Well, women's suffrage movements do in fact gain momentum before World War I, but they don't happen across the country, and they certainly don't happen evenly. If you look, they happen in the West. Before 1870, 2 states have granted women the right to vote. This does not necessarily mean that these are national federal elections. This means that to some degree, whether this be state elections or local elections, women have been enfranchised. It keeps moving. You had 2 more states between 1871 and 1910. But what was people like Susan B. Anthony wanted, and what Elizabeth Cady Stanton had wanted, was a national amendment, a constitutional amendment guaranteeing women the vote in all 50 states. Well, by 1918, take a look at what has happened. It's nearly half the country that is allowing women the vote. Why the West? That is a good question. Why is it that the West tends to be blazing this trail faster than the East and faster than the South? Well, when you think about it, it's because the West was less settled. It was less conservative. And who was it that took up a lot of your homestead grants? It was single women, and they tend to control, to a degree, local politics out there. And so the West, because it's settled by independent women in part, tends to be more responsive to their needs and their demands. By 1910, the West is granting suffrage, and the East and the South, except for New York, is not. So the more established states, they tend to be the more conservative states. And the new states, those with that are sort of the frontier states, so to speak, those are the ones in which women, their participation is held in higher regard. I think these 2 posters are interesting because it highlights the sort of rhetoric that went into the women's suffrage movement. How are women asking for the vote? On what grounds are they asking for the vote? In other words, how do they justify it? Well, look at the first cartoon to the left. There's a woman, and she's identified as Mother America, and she's got all of this Reconstruction work to do. She's got the washboard of legislation. And what's she hanging up? She's hanging up child labor laws, industrial freedom, equal pay, the 8-hour day, minimum wage. What are those? Those are progressive measures. Those are things that progressives had wanted for a long time, and women tended to be on the forefront of a lot of progressive movements. And the caption below says, "A woman's work is never done." So I think this is an interesting image, and it's endlessly fascinating to me, because what you're seeing is a progressive movement, a liberal movement, if you will, that's being done to justify conservative ends. Now follow me. What do women want? They want the vote. Why do they want the vote? So that they can do what that second poster on the right is declaring they could do. Women bring all voters in the world. Let them vote. It's on behalf of their roles as caretakers and mothers. They're not going to be the radical, the more radical wing of the feminist movement that you're going to see in the 1960s. These are not the women that are going to denounce marriage and they're going to burn their bras and they're going to join the National Organization of Women now. These are not the more radical 1960s feminists. These are feminists that are couching their argument, framing their argument in the language of domesticity. Absolutely fascinating. If you can go get a master's degree one day, I would write on this one. Eventually, Woodrow Wilson does, in fact, endorse a constitutional amendment to enfranchise women. But look at the grounds on which he states his purposes. He says, the unusual circumstances of a world war in which we stand and are judged in the view not only of our own people and of our own consciences, but also in the view of all nations and peoples will, I hope, justify in your thought as it does in mine the message I have come to bring you. He's speaking to Congress, and he's calling back to his original purpose for going into the war. We're doing this to make the world safe for democracy. And now he's saying the world is judging us based on this statement. He goes on. I regard the concurrence of the Senate in the constitutional amendment proposing the extension of the suffrage to women as vitally essential to the successful prosecution of the great war of humanity in which we are engaged. Look at this. It is essential to the war effort that we enfranchise women. Women are doing a lot of work on behalf of the war effort. We have made partners of the women in this war. Shall we admit them only to a partnership of suffering and sacrifice and toil, and not to a partnership of privilege and right? So this is the question that I, again, find absolutely fascinating. Was suffrage, was the movement to grant the vote to women, women's suffrage, a progressive measure, or is it a diplomatic tool meant to gain political capital at Versailles? A very interesting proposal. Very interesting. I don't know the answer. I tend to think that without World War I, no, women don't get the vote. I don't see things being motivated by progressivism, but more by the war's needs. Well, at length, the last state ratifies the 19th Amendment. The last state happened to be Tennessee. And it reads, the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. This is exactly the wording that had been first introduced by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony in 1848. And it was, of course, never entertained until 1887. But finally, it has passed. Women shall have the vote, and states shall not abridge that right. Well, following the passage of the 19th Amendment, suffragettes moved on to their next goal, which was something called the Equal Rights Amendment. It was authored by a leading suffragette named Alice Paul, and it reads, equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Now, what this is asking for is for women to be protected as a special class of citizens under the 14th Amendment. You'll notice that equality of rights under the law. And so we're saying, just as the Kim Wong-Ark case had recognized Chinese people as a protected class, and you're going to see black people recognized as a protected class of citizens under the 14th Amendment. Alice Paul would like women to be a recognized class under the 14th Amendment. Does it pass? It's very interesting. Does it pass? Did it pass? Has it passed? It did not pass. and it has not passed. In fact, the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, did not pass in 1923 and has been reintroduced into every Congress since. It has still not passed. Now, I want to show you a map, two maps that I think are really telling. These are the states that ratified the 19th Amendment. All the green states said, yes, we will ratify the 19th Amendment, which protects women's rights to vote in every state and in every election. The red states are the states that oppose the 19th Amendment, and it doesn't take a whole lot of analysis to be able to tell us where they were. They're across the South. The old Confederacy, the more conservative states, are the states that are opposing the 19th Amendment, and it passed in spite of them. Now let's look at a map of the states today, 2015, the states that have ratified the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment. There they are. You got a couple out in the West. The West is becoming increasingly conservative, especially after 1980. And Illinois, Missouri. But for the most part, except for Texas, the Confederacy, the old states of the Confederacy, are the ones that are standing in the way of the Equal Rights Amendment. Now, we'll go into that Equal Rights Amendment more when we get to Phyllis Schlieffen and the rise of the right in the 1980s, but I encourage you to look it up and learn more about the Equal Rights Amendment. It's one of those pieces of legislation that's been in ratification limbo since 1923, and I think you owe it to yourself to go look it up and find out why. Well, the last question, and then I'm done with you at an hour and 54 seconds. Wow. Woodrow Wilson said that the Great War was fought to keep the world safe for democracy. Was it?